Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is March 13th, 2025, and I'm honored to have with me today Dr. Assal and Professor Marc Owen Jones, two of the most prominent voices and most astute analysts of the role that media and disinformation have played post October 7th, 2023, and continue to play through the present day in manufacturing consent for Israel's war in Gaza, as well as its wider military campaigns and territorial expansion in Lebanon and Syria. I'm going to include their full bios in the show notes, but just briefly, and I expect that most of the audience is probably familiar with both of my guests from social media because they are absolute heroes on Twitter and other places, or I should say X. So first we have Dr. Assal, who I'm going to refer to as Assal unless she doesn't want me to, um, who was kind enough to do a podcast with me just over a year ago. I'll have a link to that in the show notes as well. Assal is a scholar of Middle East history. She works on research and writing related to U.S. foreign policy issues, the Middle East, and contemporary Iran. She's widely published and featured in U.S. and international media, and she has gained huge prominence post-October 7th with her regular publication of posts on social media, drawing attention to the way mainstream media outlets are covering or miscovering or not covering Israel's policies and actions. And you can follow her it's at ampersand Assal on X. I should also say she has recently become a non-resident fellow at Dawn as well. So that's good news. Also welcome Professor Jones. Professor Jones, can I call you Marc?
Sure.
Yes, he's nodding. Good. So Marc is an associate professor of media analytics at Northwestern University in Qatar, where he specializes in researching and lecturing on disinformation, digital authoritarianism, and political repression. His recent work is focused on investigating social media disinformation and harassment campaigns emanating from and targeting the Middle East. He is widely known, including to a wide audience on X/Twitter, for his pioneering analysis of disinformation campaigns. As in, if you start seeing some trends on Twitter or on X and they look suspicious, follow Marc, and chances are he's already mapped it and figured out who's behind it. And you can follow him. It's ampersand Marc Owen Jones, all one word. So welcome, Marc and Assal.
Hey, great to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So just to set the scene, and I will say any time is a good time and a very fortunate time to talk to Assal and Marc, but I invited them specifically now because as it happens, they've each recently published important new research work analysis related to our topic today, which is manufacturing consent, disinformation, misinformation, etc. So I'm going to just mention these and we'll be citing, I'll be referring to them throughout the podcast. And I will have links, of course, in the show notes. So Assal has an article published March 4th, 2025. It's published by Dawn entitled, How Western Media Has Manufactured Consent for Atrocities from Iraq to Gaza. And Marc has a new peer-reviewed journal article published March 1st, 2025 in Third World Quarterly entitled, Evidencing alethocide. Did I get that right? Alethocide. Israel's War on Truth in Gaza. So I highly recommend everyone read both of those. They're fantastic, and we're going to go forward and talk about them now. So Assal, you're up first. So I actually want you to start pretty basic. I want you to start off by explaining the concept of manufacturing consent, which is, I think, for a lot of us in the political science policy space, something we'd heard, but I have to be honest, it's not something I'd really thought about that much in the context of Israel-Palestine until the past couple of years. So where does this term come from? And for the audience, the part of the audience that doesn't remember back to the early aughts, can you talk about how analysts apply this concept to the run-up to the 2003 Iraq War and its aftermath, which is the last time in my memory this issue really, this framing really had currency in the political narrative?
Sure. So Manufacturing Consent is the title of a book by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman from the late 1980s. So that's important to understand because of its Cold War context in the late 80s when this is being published. And the crux of the argument to where, that's related to what we're talking about is that the mass media in the US is effectively a propaganda machine. It's actually an ideological institution. And the reason why that's so important to understand is because that is a direct contradiction to the way that the media is presented in the West, right? When we talk about it, the idea of the free press as opposed to a state-run media of an authoritarian state is that in liberal democracies of the West, we have a free media and a free press. And what this argument of manufacturing consent did is it really sort of contradicted that entire foundation by saying, no, as an ideological institution that's beholden to, it's also a for-profit institution, right? So it's beholden to corporate interests. It's beholden the media is beholden to advertisers. Behind that is corporations. So there's all these interests that actually influence the way that the media operates. And in so doing, they manufacture consent for whatever sort of the corporate/government interests are. There's other aspects to the argument, things like access, right? It's much easier to get access to people or nodes of power, whether that be state or corporate, when you appease them. You could take a very concrete example of what that means. Imagine just a few months ago when we had a scene in a US press briefing, in a State Department press briefing, where journalist Sam Hosseini was basically wrangled out of the room because he doesn't, he's not appeasing essentially the state. He's not going along with the state narrative. He's challenging it very, very directly. And this causes, we're free press, but if you really challenge what the state is saying, there's limitations to what you're allowed to do. And that's a concrete example recently of that. And the other aspect of the argument in manufacturing consent, at least in the Cold War context, was that there was also a creation of sort of a common enemy, right? A filter through which politically, through which this information was being filtered through. And at that time, it was anti-communism. And what Chomsky then in the early 2000s argues is that in the wake of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union, the new filter is the war on terror. And that makes sense in the context that you're talking about, the 2003 invasion of Iraq. So how is this applied as a concept to the invasion of Iraq? We now know as fact that and people knew it at the time, of course, but now it's indisputable that the claims that the Bush administration was making at the time to legitimize its invasion of Iraq were completely fabricated and false. The idea that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction was false. The fact that there was a link to 9/11 was false. And yet, whereas the role of the press, theoretically, right, we talk about, we have the White House Correspondents' Dinner every year that toasts the free press. What they're supposed to do, theoretically, is tell the truth, right? They're not supposed to repeat what the state says. They're supposed to find what the truth is. And they didn't do that. They didn't find what the truth was, because the truth was that there were no weapons of mass destruction. The truth was that the Bush administration was creating lies, fabrications in order to justify their invasion. And so there's a lot of literature and documentation about this already, that the role that the media played in manufacturing public consent. So how you have an American populace that at the time is fairly supportive of the war. Now, in retrospect, they're not supportive of the war, because once you realize, oh, none of that was true, then, and obviously the chaos that happens in the wake of the invasion of Iraq, now there's a consensus, even amongst the people who supported, the officials who supported the war, right? There's a consensus that this was a major US blunder, that it was a mistake, and that was based on lies. That happened, the public perception happens because of the role of the media. That's where people are getting their information from. They're obviously listening to what the officials at the time are saying, but the average American is not studying deeply what is going on in the region. And so they're relying on their media diets, where they're getting information from. And this is pre-social media, right? We're looking at 2002, 2003. So really, the only source of information outside of, say, an academic institution is whatever the media is showing you and whatever they're telling you. And so that is the sort of crux of the argument, and how manufacturing consent became related to the war on terror and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And then I would argue we're seeing that exact same pattern unfold with the genocide in Gaza.
Excellent. And we're going to get into that next part in just a moment. I do find myself, as I listen to you, I'm thinking about all of the news outlets right now where the main thing they do is try to get exclusive breaking, which are basically things that are leaked to them by insiders, which are then reported. I mean, it's the stenography that reported as news. I mean, like literally that's the template. Breaking news, exclusive, and just means someone leaked something to you. All right, Marc, we're going to come to you for a moment. And now, again, very basic. So I already mispronounced it once. At the heart of your article is a new concept that you have introduced into the lexicon, which is alethocide. Can you flesh out first how to say this word, what this term means, and also why this new concept, in your view, and you've convinced me, having read your paper, my view as well, was needed to analyze and understand current political and historical dynamics? And also, can you just briefly explain how this concept, alethicide, differs from concepts like disinformation or misinformation? You know, what is where it's different?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm pronouncing it alethocide, just as I'm not Greek, but it comes from the Greek aletheia, meaning truth, and the Latin, suffix side, meaning killing. And I deliberately chose the Greek plus Latin combination because that's the way the term genocide was constructed, genus and side. And I wanted to actually, keep it in that tradition of terminology. I mean, I had one point even thought about using like an Arabic style portmanteau because I was conceiving this in the genocide in Gaza and like hakaktal, but then I actually thought, this is a term that I think needs to be universalized for any other potential genocide. And the reason I think it was necessary, I mean, I know people think, do we need another neologism? And you know, we've had a number actually, I think, that have become prominent since October the 7th. We've had domicide, right, which is like the mass destruction of housing. People have even used the term scholasticide, the mass killing of scholars and universities. And this situates itself within a sort of known term, which is epistemicide, right, which is the destruction of ways of knowing and truth, right? If you, for example, kill a native population or exterminate them, you're not just killing people, but you're killing their culture, their history, or books about their history, these kind of artifacts that are very important to them. And so I thought, well, there's something different going on here that's not quite. I mean, there is epistemicide. This has been going on for some time, but I think the mass spread of disinformation that we've seen since October 7th, emanating from Israel, was worthy of another name. And I'll get to why. Part of it is because disinformation itself, I think, is a very limiting category, right? So disinformation is the deliberate spread of false information. And often when we talk about disinformation, we talk about something that's episodic. It's, oh, here was a piece of disinformation. Someone spread this information about, I don't know, vaccines not working. Let's see who spread it, why they spread it, that kind of thing. But then I was struck by there was a need to actually think about false news, not just in the service of war, but in the service of mass killing. How can you just call something disinformation when what it's actually functioning as is a means to try and legitimize genocide, right? It's like having the difference between you kill a person or you have a massacre, you have a group of massacres, right? A piece of disinformation is somehow distinct from several lies, and I think in order to try and legitimize genocide, you need to have a term that actually is appropriate to that. And the sort of key aspect of alethocide, I suppose, is scale. That's one aspect. But what separates it, I suppose, is this notion of systemic and systematic, right? So when we talk about systemic, we're talking about it goes to the heart of the regime. When we talk, disinformation is anyone can be spreading it. But if you have high-level officials, government officials, actively spreading falsehoods that are designed to either dehumanize, mislead, or completely represent another truth to people watching what's unfolding in Gaza, that is significant. Just as in genocide, you have to sort of talk about the notion of intent. And intent often comes from high-level officials. So if high-level officials are engaging in these falsehoods, and it's systematic, and by systematic I mean routine, funded, there's considerable effort going into it, then to me, there's two combinations here, systemic and systematic, that are really important. And I think that's why we need this term for alethocide, and not least because we're also living in this post-truth age where, it seems that there's this kind of denigration of fact, denigration of truth, denigration of experts. And I think that's why it was important, because it's trying to fundamentally capture the scale and the egregiousness of the way in which we are being misled. And to draw on what Assal was saying, there's a level of manufacturing consent in the mainstream media, but this is about manufacturing consent and fundamentally attenuating or reducing the things that we do and do not see. And so the reason why sort of truth killing is both the killing of truth in terms of what we can and cannot see, but also the legitimization of killing through the modulation of truth. And I guess we'll come to this later, but one of the reasons I thought it was evident is that we've seen so many examples now of this level of lying, disinformation, falsehoods over the past 2 years and throughout history, but particularly in the past 2 years, that I think point to this systemic and systematic use of alethocide. So I document them in my piece quite clearly, because I'm saying, here's the evidence, right? Here's the evidence of all these lies. Here's the evidence of high-level actors spreading them. Here's the evidence of, X, Y, Z in Israeli ministry paying for this campaign, right? And so, that's why I think we need this term, and I think we need to appreciate the gravity of this, because genocide happens for a number of reasons, but one of them, in the particular case of Gaza, is obviously there is consent for that to happen, in part from the Israeli society, but also from Israel's allies, like the West, right? These things can only happen because of a nature of legitimization that happens due to people's perception of reality. I do think if most people truly understood what was going on, or truly had empathy with the victims, which is also removed through alethocide, they would think differently, and the outcome might be somewhat different.
Yeah, I have to say, when I was reading your article, I had a few of these just sort of moments of sort of, I would say, like aha moments. I realized that there's something I've been grasping to articulate in arguing with people, that there's the almost alternative reality that has been developed by propaganda, hasbara, by the fact that every single thing that's true is then placed into doubt and an alternative narrative is put there. And I think that's really what you've captured, I think, quite effectively in this framing. So we're going to dig more into that in a second. I want to come back to you, Assal. You, in July of 2024, you published an article entitled, I love this, I fixed the New York Times pro-Israel headlines in Gaza, which when you Google it actually comes up with, I fixed it for you, which is, the line that you use a lot of times in your posts, which I love. You talk there about your experience in post-October 7th world, in effect becoming the fact checker and the public corrector of Gaza-related headlines, not just in the New York Times, but elsewhere, but specifically in the so-called newspaper record. And you concluded, showing receipts and showing your work, that, and I will quote you, the language of the New York Times and much of the US media is misleading by design. So I want you to talk about this phenomenon of misleading by design, because you're clearly attributing intent, and I think that's important, because oftentimes people say you can be an observer, but you're not allowed to attribute intent. It's like genocide; it depends on intent. I want you to talk about this intent that you're seeing and how it connects to the manufacturing of consent for Israeli atrocities in Gaza and elsewhere. And relatedly, and I don't know if you can you talk about, well, if you want to, how you came to focus on this? I mean, why are headlines so important? And I think part of this is for those who are in the audience who aren't avid consumers of social media. Why are these headlines so important, whether it's print or maybe more importantly in social media?
Well, I think the point of intent, and Marc, you did such a great job of explaining how, in terms of how information is being understood, that notion of intent is so important as well. And when you talk about it in this situation, headlines, we'll talk about that first. Why are headlines important? Because like I said, I'm like, people, just think about the way that you consume information. Like I am privy to information having to do with Israel-Palestine because I've followed it since I was an undergraduate student as an activist. I decided to pursue a graduate level degree in understanding the history of the region. Like someone like me is I can't expect everybody to have that kind of understanding. It'd be ridiculous, in the same way that I have no understanding of so many different phenomenons that other people have expertise in. So then how does an average person, how does an average American, how does an average anybody anywhere formulate ideas? Where do they formulate their opinions from? This is where the media becomes so important. And the other reality of that, right, not just the fact that everybody is not an expert in these fields, is that everybody's not reading about everything, right? So passive information, the way that we're getting information that helps shape the way that we think, is often coming in the headline. It's the ticker at the bottom, right? It's the words that you repeatedly hear. That's precisely how propaganda works, by the way. You just say something over and over and over and over again, and eventually people will internalize that concept as fact. I'll give you an example. Has anybody ever heard the sentence, Israel has the right to defend itself? Probably, because it gets repeated over and over and over again until no one questions the logic of, wait, why doesn't anybody else have the right to defend themselves? Why don't you ever hear Lebanon has the right to defend itself? Iran has the right to defend itself. Palestinians or Palestine, the word Palestine, has the right to defend itself. No such language exists because it's never used. And so nothing is questioned about it. And that's why these flashes, right, this flash of information, these words that you're seeing become so important. The selection of the words, right? The fact that Palestinians, even if they are children that are detained for no reason or cause with no charge, are called prisoners. But an Israeli soldier taken from a tank is called a hostage, not a prisoner of war. We're supposedly talking about a war, right? I would refer to it as genocide. Most of the world does now, but we say it's a war, but somehow none of the soldiers are prisoners of war. They are hostages. Children on the Palestinian side, prisoners. This language is intentionally used, and you can see it very oftentimes in the same news story or in the same headline or the same social media post, right? The few words that people are seeing. How often do you think people actually click the link and read the entire article? Forgetting the fact that so much of it is paywalled. And so people don't even necessarily have access to that information. So then what you're putting in the headline, I mean, what is like a proper headline is supposed to give you the gist of what happened. So if you say attack in Gaza kills 20, that does not give you the gist of what happened because you don't know who got killed and you don't know who killed them. Basic information that can very easily be put into a headline by adding one or two words, right? Which you see, by the way, the juxtaposition of those headlines is the way that the same news outlets are carrying stories about, say, Russia or Iran or other Western adversaries, and the way that the language is used is completely different. So this is where it shows intent. Now, if that wasn't enough to show you intent, look at the fact that there was an Intercept story last year about a leaked New York Times memo. And guess what the leaked memo said? Words that you should not be using: genocide, ethnic cleansing, Palestine, right? Why so often do you hear Palestinians referred to as Gazans and not Palestinians? Because you try to avoid using those words, right? Palestine altogether is erased from the lexicon. So all of this, I mean, that's the smoking gun of intent, right? When you actually see a memo that says don't use these words, there's nothing more clear than the fact that that is intentional. Now, when you then look at the record, you can clearly see how that memo manifests in the way that the language is curated to create a very specific image. And I think that's why headlines are important, and that's where you get this notion of intent. It is absolutely by design because they do it repeatedly. Like, it is not difficult to just add the word Israel into a headline. That's it. So much would be different if you had to read a headline every day, if every day the words that you saw was Israel kills children, Israel kills women, Israel kills men. If you saw those words together repeatedly as a pattern, which is what's actually happening, then it would affect the way that you're shaping your opinions of things. But when all you're really seeing is, well, Israel says they were targeting Hamas. Israel says they were doing this. Israel says they were doing that. Well, why does it matter what Israel says? What's the truth? That's the job of the press. What happened? Not what does Israel say?
Yeah, I'm finding myself thinking about, there's a headline from the Onion that I think you've run a couple of times about, various ways press works hard to find new ways to not say genocide or something. Just all the effort of the headline writers to not use the word genocide. Yeah, yeah. All right, Marc, I'm coming back to you and your cat. Anyone who's not watching this, there's an adorable cat in the frame. It makes everybody feel happier in life. So thank you for that.
I don't want to disturb her because she's she's calm now, so that's why I haven't
Yes,
moved.
never disturb a calm cat.
Right.
So you talked about this a little before. I'm going to quote a little
Mm.
bit from your piece. In your article, you write, among other things, quote, to accept genocide, an alternative reality that legitimizes it, genocide must be created, hence alethocide, truth killing. You go on to write, and this is really the heart of the matter, and you referenced it a second ago, but I want you to go a little deeper. Alethicide refers to a systematic strategy that not only erases truths around egregious acts of violence, but also actively constructs false narratives that seek to reshape societal norms, manipulate public opinion, and dismantle solidarity movements seeking to end that violence. It is a symbiosis of both disinformation and propaganda. This process is both systemic and systematic, as you were talking about, marked by the involvement of high-level political actors and modulated by the broader geopolitical and technopolitical landscape in which disinformation operates as a tool of state power that both abets genocide and reinforces hegemonic structures. There's so much to unpack in that paragraph. I hope people really will take the time to read this and think about it and go deeper. I want you to talk a little bit more about the kinds and scope of truth killing in
Mm.
play in the post October 7th context and the actors involved. You referenced this, but I want you to go into, I want you to pick one of the cases, because you have some
Yeah.
case studies in this paper. The ones that stick in my mind are the beheaded babies and UNRWA, but if there's one you prefer, but I'd like you just to take a moment and use one of those cases to walk us through this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so firstly, I think one thing I want to highlight is that when you have sort of a piece of disinformation, right? Just let's just say any piece of disinformation, it's like the tree falls in the forest, right? If there's no one there to listen to it, what does it matter if someone's lying? Okay, so the interesting thing here is we have a situation where Israel's falsehoods, right, aren't the ones that fall in the forest when there's no one listening. And the things that affect it are what I call modulators. And modulating just means to sort of attenuate or to lower, to increase, decrease something. And I just want to mention those things briefly because I think it's important in why we're hearing so much of this Israel's narrative, whether it's for example, the New York Times, as I mentioned, or otherwise. And I have a few categories. One is geopolitics, the other is technopolitics, one is resources, one is expertise, hierarchy, media, and epistemic vulnerability. I won't go into too much detail, but just to say is that, if we hear a story, for example, at the beginning, soon after October the 7th, it was there was a narrative going around that Hamas had beheaded babies, and that soon became Hamas had beheaded 40 babies. This was unsubstantiated, right? It was an unsubstantiated, unverified claim. As Assal said, the press's job should have been to verify that before it got anywhere near a headline. But for example, in the UK, the following day, I think most domestic papers had some permutation of that story on their front page, right? It hadn't even been verified. So how does a story like that, that's disinformation, it's false, become everywhere, right? And this is what I think is an interesting example of this creation of a false reality, right? One that is
Marc,
specifically.
can you just talk about how we
Yeah.
know it's false? Because not everyone
Right.
listening will have followed this in the detail we have
Okay.
developed.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, firstly, it was false. The story came out because in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th, when there was sort of chaotic amount of information, there was some reporting on I-24 News, which is an Israeli news channel, that someone had seen 40 babies being carried out in gurneys. Then there was a separate story that someone said Hamas had beheaded babies. This again was not evidence, and even Israel a few weeks later had denied it, right? So it was just false reporting in the moment from Israeli reporters basically speaking to IDF soldiers on the ground and no filtering. And then some of these stories were also reinforced by members of Israeli first responding outfits who also made other claims about babies, including, for example, a pregnant woman had been killed and there was a fetus attached to an umbilical cord still like hanging out. There was a few stories like this, right? They were not corroborated. And when I say false, very early on, it's about saying that there's no verified source, right? And also, if you have, and this goes back to, I suppose, the Gulf War, if you have any sort of knowledge of the history of propaganda or disinformation, one always has to approach stories about dead or murdered children with caution, right? As early as World War One, we saw people making up stories about Germans killing babies, German soldiers killing babies, stabbing them with their bayonets. In the 1990 Gulf War, a PR company, Hill and Knowlton, trained Naira, who ended up being the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the US, to say that she saw Iraqi soldiers taking babies out of bassinets in a Kuwait hospital and putting them on the ground to die. That later turned out also to be false and actually deliberately constructed false narrative. So one has to approach these with caution. And this story was then, it immediately went viral, right? So how did all these accounts, including Israeli embassy accounts around the world, spreading this narrative that 40 babies been beheaded, they had not verified it. They were not providing evidence about the story. It soon then was repeated by the president, Joe Biden at the time, who said he'd seen beheaded babies. I don't know what he'd seen because clearly there wasn't any evidence of that. And so you have a situation where you have something that goes viral. It's promoted systemically in the sense it's being promoted by official Israeli accounts, the Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs. I think the Israeli embassy in France promoted this story. It was promoted across multiple news organizations, but crucially, it was without hesitation, almost reflexively promoted by, I suppose in a way, the chief influencer, which was Joe Biden, right? He came out and said this, right? So you have a disinformation that, it falls in the forest, but before long, it's actually then being repeated by the most powerful person in the world, right? It's got almost a direct line to that. And I think that set the stage, I think, for what happened after October the 7th and the genocide, because what the purpose of this is obviously, killing babies is a moral red line for most people. And, like I said, we've seen it throughout conflict in history. And immediately, and this was also at the same time Israel were launching an official campaign of Hamas is ISIS, is to portray both Palestinians, Hamas and Palestinians, as brutal, as inhuman, as barbaric, because only a barbarian would kill babies. And this narrative was then appropriated, and actually the Israeli government paid for ads, right, that were in theory targeting children in Europe and the US. They were running ads on gaming sites in YouTube, right, that looked like they were targeted at children. You had like pink pastel colors, rainbows, and then suddenly it was interrupted by this story that Hamas had beheaded 40 babies, and it was designed to get people's parents to see it, right? So when we talk about systemic as well, we're also talking about Israeli government entities paying money to promote a false narrative long after it was even debunked by Israeli officials, right? So then you have another level, and this goes back to what Assal was saying about intent. And when we talk about intent and systemic, right? It's like you've almost acknowledged that this is false, but still you're going to perpetuate that falsehood. Not only that, but spend millions of dollars. And I think this particular advertising campaign, there was at least $7 million spent on spreading this information about 40 beheaded babies, right? And there's one more thing I'd like to mention in that, and that's the technopolitics level of this. In order to pay for these adverts to run on YouTube, this is Google, this is American companies taking money to actually put out these false narratives that are designed to dehumanize Palestinians, which are therefore designed to legitimize further violence against them. They are taking money for that. And they, at the same time, are demoting algorithmically pro-Palestinian content. So they're demoting one reality, the Palestinian reality, right? And they are promoting a falsehood that's designed to legitimize genocide and taking money at the same time to do that, right? So you have all these factors in play that I think are sort of a fundamental example of alethocide unfolding, right? You have hierarchy in terms of the Joe Biden, other officials spreading it. You have technopolitics, you have tech companies involved in perpetuating this rumor. And you also have, just the resources, I mean, the cost, the amount of money that requires to spend this. And you have, and goes back to the manufacturing consent again, because the mainstream media is always crucial, is this kind of willing and receptive media that uncritically embraces narratives that are pro-Israel and anti-Palestinian.
Yeah, it also occurs to me part of alethocide, like genocide. Genocide is not just the act of doing it, it's what's been done to people. Truth is now dead in this conflict. I still encounter people arguing with me on social media saying, well, how can you support these people? They killed babies. I'm like, A, I don't support Hamas, and B, the dead baby story is fake and has been debunked by Israelis. It doesn't matter. It almost seems like truth is just a casualty here completely, and there's almost a sense of, well, it doesn't matter that it's not true, it could be true, and the narrative, it fits into a narrative that's now accepted. So truth is dead going forward as well. We've written a different history here.
Yeah, it creates an epistemic crisis, right? So by that I mean it just creates this, it's a weaponization of doubt, inculcates doubt. It creates people are then able to accept multiple possibilities. Maybe it did happen, maybe it didn't. As soon as you insert that level of doubt into a narrative, you've created a destabilizing effect, right? And the people that benefit from that in this case are Israel.
Can I tack onto this for a second?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because this is such a fascinating conversation. And as Marc, as you're talking, I'm just like, oh yeah, I remember when this happened. The idea of the advertising I thought was so interesting. I can't remember if it was the Human Rights Watch report or the Amnesty International report that concluded that Israel's committing genocide. But when you Googled it, when the report first came out, and if you tried to Google it, I think it was Human Rights Watch,
I think
the
it was,
first thing that would pop up, sorry?
Sorry, was it the Amnesty one on apartheid or was it one on genocide?
No, this was recent. This was
Oh,
one of the
okay,
genocide.
yeah.
So this was one of the genocide reports for sure.
Yeah.
I just can't remember which institution it
Right.
was. Both of them have reports
Yes.
on Israel committing genocide. But it was, if you Googled it, the first thing that you would see was an ad on Google from the Israeli government that like basically denigrated that institution, right? That said that they are anti-Semitic or some way of basically opposing the argument that was being made by that institution. And this idea of accountability, right? These companies that just think, well, they're paying us, we may as well take out the ad. Now, would Hamas ever be able to take out an ad? I feel that that's unlikely. So it's not just, well, they're paying us, it's who is paying us and what are we willing to share? And there is this question of accountability that I feel like we don't talk about enough. And I think the most pressing example of that is the Holocaust. When we talk about how does something like this happen? Because look, if you grew up in, the last however many decades, especially in the West, you have studied World War II and the Holocaust over and over and over again because it is so important to understand this history for it to, in fact, never happen again, right? Like that is so important to understand that. And part of it, I mean, obviously the dehumanization of Jewish people, that entire systematic process of dehumanizing the entire group of people in order to justify atrocities and genocide against them. But there were so many questions about, okay, well, who were the engineers who built these camps or built these chambers? Who were the workers who worked on them? Who were the professors at universities or the institutions at universities who were advisors for PhDs about the Jewish question? All of this is pieces of an entire apparatus that was built to dehumanize Jewish people in order to justify a genocide against them. And then when you take all of those examples, the examples of, again, like a tech company that thinks, well, we're just taking an advertisement, but you're playing a role. There's accountability for all of this because that is how you create an entire ecosystem that dehumanizes Palestinians and justifies in the minds of so many people, once they are lesser human, once they are not seen as human, that this is okay. And what changed the views for so many people when it came to the Holocaust and I mean, you're talking about millennia of anti-Semitism, was how horrific the atrocities of the Holocaust were, right? This overrides all of that systemic propaganda because, and Marc, I think you made this point, most people take issue with killing babies because it is unnatural as a human being. It is unnatural for you to be okay with the killing of children and babies, right? Our most natural response is to protect them. And I think you saw the same thing happen with the genocide in Gaza. The sheer volume of videos coming out of you seeing these images is what started to create a shift because people couldn't deny it anymore. And as much as the propaganda machine was trying to work, you couldn't deny the images that you were seeing. And in contrast to that, when you talk about a story like 40 beheaded babies, where are the stories? Who are they? Who are these babies? Right? The fact that you don't know, that there are no names, that there's no story behind it is evidence in and of itself that that's a falsehood because clearly we would know that information because that story would be told. And so I just thought it was so interesting listening to this idea that, they're taking out I mean, the YouTube ones, I know exactly which ones you're talking about. Horrific. How do you allow that kind of advertising to target children? But there's no filter. It's a for-profit industry. They're taking money and they're spreading this disinformation. And sorry, I just thought those were the things that came to my mind when Marc was talking.
Yeah, I mean, the advertising piece of it the Google piece is interesting because, I mean, I don't know if people understand that you basically bid for advertisement, you bid for placement. So if anyone, say a human rights organization or UNRWA or something, wants to be at the top, they actually have to outbid the Israeli government so that when their own search term is searched, their own name is searched, they're the first search term. I mean, you're actually competing with the, 3 point whatever billion dollars the US gives Israel as a first world nation. That's what you're bidding against as an organization, to try to make sure that people don't see propaganda first when they see your name. Not that they can see it at all, they'll see it. So Marc, did you have something here, or should we start, can I come back to you?
Yeah, I mean, I just, it's always a delight being able to speak alongside Assal, and I'm sure we could talk for hours. But the killing of, it's interesting because the killing of babies and this idea that it's a moral red line for everyone. But as Assal said, it's that changed. And what was really interesting about the Israeli propaganda, and again, this idea of dehumanization, which is so key in alethocide, right? Is that I remember when one of the Israeli official accounts, when it was became clear, right, for example, that they could no longer hide that they were killing lots of children and babies. Then what do you do when it comes to your disinformation and your falsehoods? Well, that was a really interesting thing because we saw. I mean, I included a cartoon in my article, and it's a cartoon that was shared by an official Israeli account where you see like two babies, right? One is being poured with there's like a cup full of blue liquid pouring into a baby, and it says love on the cup, right? And this is Israel. And then you have the other baby who looks really angry with like a fire coming out of his hand and is red, and hatred's being poured into that baby, right? And that's the Palestinian baby, right? And this is an actual cartoon shared by an Israeli government ministry. And what does that say? It says, well, okay, when you can no longer hide the fact that you're killing babies, then you move to the next stage, which is to say, well, there must be babies worth killing. And then you dehumanize babies. And that to me is such a shift. It's such a moral shift because if one of the fundamental sort of propaganda approaches is to sort of say your enemy is killing babies, but you then go to a place like we need to justify we're killing babies because it's pretty clear we're killing way, way, way more babies. Then you have to dehumanize babies, and this was all precipitated by Isaac Herzog going out on X and holding Mein Kampf again, evoking images of anti-Semitism. You take Mein Kampf, obviously, which is this sort of epitome of anti-Semitism, and say it was found under a child's bed. Right? This all happened at the same time, right? So there's clearly a strategic narrative here that's trying to conflate this idea of even children are guilty, even children are anti-Semitic, even children aren't innocent in this. And again, that goes back to this notion of truth killing. It's an absolutely it's not just a fundamental change of truth. It's manipulating the reality to even make us challenge our own moral code of who deserves to die and who deserves to live. And that to me is really kind of this sort of apex of alethocide, of not just lying, but lying in a way that's designed to shift people's whole moral compass,
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite insidious, having, for all of us who've watched this develop over the course of the last year and a half, the what dehumanization means in practice. I mean, whether it's their own fault because they're being used as human shields, or why do Palestinians, they hate us more than they love their children. They force us to kill their children, which is language I've heard my whole life. To the every baby is a budding terrorist. All right, I have one more round for both of you, and I want to sort of look a little bit ahead if we can. So Asal, in your article, I'm going to quote from you. And your article starts with Iraq and then ends at the current situation. So you conclude, as far as the media is concerned, it appears no lessons were learned from the catastrophic results of the Iraq War more than 20 years ago. Major Western media, such as the New York Times, Associated Press, Reuters, BBC, and similar legacy outlets, have largely spent the past year whitewashing Israel's genocide in Gaza, uncritically repeating Israeli government claims, and talking points about Gaza, just as they did the Bush administration's about Iraq. So we've been through this. That observation, for me, is as devastating as it is manifestly accurate. At the same time, though, you do seem to close the article with a slightly hopeful note. You say the world has changed a great deal since the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. We've talked about this a little bit. Social media, smartphones, independent journalism, and citizen journalists in Gaza have shown Americans and everyone around the world what the U.S. government and media have tried to hide. So in this last round, I want you to talk about the implications of this change that you are observing. and how it challenges the effort to manufacture consent. And specifically, two things I want you to talk about. Again, this phenomenon of headlines and reporting, there is reporting that does accurately reflect what's happening. These are still the exception that prove the rule too much of the time, but they exist. But talk about those exceptions and how they come about and where their future is, and because that's kind of hopeful. And second, what does this all mean for impunity? I mean, and we obviously have the ICC as the question of impunity right now, but the fact that the news is getting out, what does that mean compared to, say, the Iraq War, of what it means to get away with this or not, going forward, if, like, say, we're talking 20 years from now? You're still muted.
Sorry, I was going to say there's a lot to unpack there, but in terms of social media, if we talk about social media for a second, like any other mode of communication or new technology, it's a double-edged sword, right? It can be used, on one hand, it's being used to get information to people that they would otherwise not have because it's not being covered in mainstream media. On the other hand, it's obviously a tool for spreading misinformation, spreading that the exact stories that Marc was referring to. Where are they spreading so quickly that everybody is seeing 40 beheaded babies, 40 beheaded babies? They're also seeing that on social media. So there's propaganda is not something new. It's not something that was created because of social media. Social media is just the most recent like iteration of how information is spread. And it can be both good and bad. The good side, the positive aspect of it, and what you clearly see that but the sort of nodes of power see as a challenge to the status quo or a challenge to their narrative is the fact that anybody can share information on it. I mean, why did they attack TikTok? The Ken Klippenstein has an actual article that speaks to the fact that it wasn't even, they're not even, pretending like it was China. It was because of Israel, right? The reason why they go after TikTok is because TikTok's being consumed by many, many people around the world, especially younger generation, and they are overwhelmed with these images that are coming from Gaza, that not that you never see them.
And let's be clear, these images are largely generated by Israeli soldiers. So you can't even say this is anti-Israel propaganda. What they're spreading are the videos that soldiers themselves are taking of themselves committing atrocities, or at least violations of basic laws of war and human rights and dignity of man, kind of thing.
Well, it's both. That's an excellent point, though, because I was actually thinking of like Palestinian journalists that are sharing what is happening to Palestinians. But that is an excellent point because, yes, and this actually draws us to impunity. Imagine the level of impunity that you have to operate under to think, I can take a picture of myself wearing the clothes of this woman I probably just murdered. And it's really cute and funny and haha, I'm playing with children's toys. The children aren't here anymore. Like the most sort of brazen and inhuman way of dealing with a civilian population that has been killed. And you're a soldier in the military that's doing this to them, you're now mocking them and sharing it on social media. And what happened was because of that, it's put Israeli soldiers in a precarious situation when they try to travel abroad, because in fact, you are breaking international law. And while that system is deeply, deeply flawed and basically in tatters now because of the way that the US approached the genocide in Gaza, it still exists to some extent. Those institutions still exist. And so you actually have on the Israeli side now them giving guidelines to their soldiers, not don't commit war crimes, don't post them on social media. Delete your social media before you travel abroad. These are the guidelines that they're getting. If you're not committing crimes, then what's wrong with your social media? But you are, and you're doing it openly because you've operated with such impunity for such a long time that they cannot even conceptualize that there might be accountability for what they are doing. And that is another very interesting role of social media in sort of spreading this kind of information and them spreading it themselves in certain situations. In terms of like the exceptions that you were talking about, I think you were referring to when some truthful sort of information is coming out. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
So it's interesting because I obviously criticize the media a lot. And that is not to say that I'm criticizing the institutions, not the individual journalists. And there's a difference between that. Not that there aren't journalists that are problematic, but there are also journalists who are doing really amazing work and they're trying to get the stories out. And
it's probably also worth saying that most journalists don't write their own headlines. Any of us
they
who've ever
don't.
submitted an op-ed know that.
They don't write their headlines at all, right? That comes down to an editor. So a lot, and even the story itself, oftentimes someone is editing it. And remember, they're following the editing guidelines of the higher ups. So that's why it's the institution that is creating the situation, less so than necessarily the journalists themselves. But of course, there's, we're talking about a large group of people, and there are people on different parts of the spectrum in the journalistic world as well. But so you see these stories, like these investigative pieces that come out that they debunk things like, the Flower Massacre, when Israel attacks Palestinians who are waiting for an aid convoy, right? You have journalistic pieces that come out that say, well, the evidence counters what Israel's narrative is, right? So you have pieces like that. You have pieces that talk about the Palestinians that have been killed, or the fact that Israel is blocking aid. Those pieces exist. The problem is, they are meant in a way to create validity of that system entirely, to say, look, we're doing this. Look at this great piece that was written. Yes, but it's an exception within this ecosystem that is meant to create the legitimacy of a free press. But in reality, the overwhelming way that the information is being presented is curated to frame it in a very particular way. And oftentimes those stories are not the ones that are being shared on social media posts. So people, you have to search it. Like I search every day. I go and I look at all these different outlets to see what they're sharing. Nobody is doing that. No average person is going out, because why would they do that? They're going on some kind of app. They're either looking at either they're going on a news app or a social media app, and they're just going through some kind of algorithm that's giving them the important stories of the day. And those are not the stories that typically will come up in that kind of a feed. Or again, all you'll see is the headline. Maybe the story itself is great. The headline doesn't tell you anything. The headline tells you 30,000 lives lost, which means nothing to anyone because it doesn't give you any information. You have to click on it, not be paywall, and read the entire article to understand what it's about. And so I think that's important to keep in mind too. It's not that there's no investigative journalism or good journalism happening. It's that it's an exception to a system that is meant to manufacture consent for genocide.
Yeah, I'm also thinking that those exceptions, when they do come out, always generate a firestorm, a well-organized firestorm of protest, which is then, I think, used to strengthen the underlying policy of not doing that kind of reporting. If it tells editors there's a very
BBC documentary that just came out as an exact example of that, right?
for high
Something
cost for doing
BBC,
it.
yeah, BBC comes out with a documentary, it immediately gets attacked, and they have to pull the documentary, or they don't have to, but they choose to pull the documentary because of the exact firestorm you're referring to.
Yeah, that was a scandal of epic proportions from a journalistic perspective. All right, so Marc, you're going to get the last word. So in the conclusion of your study, you note, I'm quoting you again, despite the limited possibilities social media platforms offer for countering propaganda, the general alignment between big tech companies, talked about that, whose platforms facilitate the dissemination of disinformation and state sponsoring disinformation campaigns reflects how technopolitical dynamics operate to serve the global status quo. So I want you to talk about this a little bit more, not just in the sense of like, they're agreeing to take money for ads, but in terms of how this actually plays out and what is the hope for the future. We're dealing with, you said, systemic and systematic disinformation, right? This is serving as both a shield and a catalyst, I'm quoting you, for physical violence, creating alternate realities, all of that. So looking ahead, if we're looking at alternative media, if we're looking at independent media, if we're looking at social media, I mean, where is there space? I'm not asking you to be hopeful if you're not hopeful, but I'm really interested to see where you see this moving. And it's a question also of like, what is needed? If we're going to, so you started by identifying alethocide, which is a great gift to the entire process of thinking about this. So thank you for that. So the next step is what has to be done to combat it. We know what's needed to combat genocide, but they're not doing it. To combat alethocide, what are the guardrails? What are the countervailing forces that need to be put in place to challenge this now and in the future?
Well, I mean, there's no silver bullet, right? So if we talk about the information space, there's multiple dynamics as we've discussed. Assal's been talking a lot about mainstream media and ownership and who has power within that. If we're talking about digital media, let's just talk about social media or tech companies for a second. I mean, it's not just about receiving money, it's about, for example, algorithms. You know, if we were to talk about how do we as a society, for example, know what X or Facebook is privileging in terms of information? Are they demoting pro-Palestinian content? Actually, we know that they are, right? So what does that mean? How do we address that particular challenge? Do we try and sue one of the richest companies in the world? Do we mobilize in that regard? But you get the Algorithmic Justice League, you get people who are pursuing that particular avenue of trying to obtain
I'm sorry,
justice.
is there really something called the Algorithmic Justice League?
Yeah, it's a thing.
Awesome. I'm
It's
sorry. I did not know
it,
that. That is
no, no,
awesome.
it's yeah, it was I think set up initially to deal with how algorithms are fundamentally racist too, because that's in a whole set of other issues, right? I mean, algorithms are Orientalist, but here we're actually just talking about, companies who particularly demote, for example, in this case, pro-Palestinian content, and if we take that to another level, then how do we affect change there? Well, you could argue that you need to break up these big tech companies who are modulating so much of the information we consume. I'm not disputing the fact that we can use these social media platforms. We do. The fact that we're on them shows that we have a presence, and some people do listen to our tweets. But how do we know, for example, we're not being shadow banned? How do we know that our voice is not being minimized and we're shouting to avoid? Well, we don't. So do we then mobilize to actually get the US, for example? And I say the US because most of these tech companies are in the US, with the exception of obviously like TikTok. Do we get them to actually use the antitrust laws to break them up? Because the smaller companies are less powerful, they're less financially resourced. It would be easier to take them to court. Yes. So already I'm just kind of breaking down from an activist perspective the different things that we need to do, from even looking at algorithmic accountability to actually breaking up these big tech companies to actually force them to be less powerful than they are. Because as we see now, and you asked me to look forward, if we're looking from the tech perspective, it's not rosy for the next 4 years. We've got one of the most horrendously pro-genocide presidents in the United States, even though he's flip-flopping. You saw the big tech bros, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, line up behind him, stand behind him like trophies at Mar-a-Lago and at the inauguration. And this all suggests that, that's not changing anytime soon, which means that we have to do more. And I do think, there are alternatives. Yes, X, you have Blue Sky, you have these rival social media platforms that allow us to communicate, and that's great. But we are seeing, new outlets come out like Zeteo or Dropsite News, right? So there are, platforms where there are people outspoken about this. And I will say that maybe a fringe benefit of the post-truth age, in the sense that we've had a sort of general decline in trust in institutions and traditional legacy media. I mean, there's the downside, which is, the proliferation of disinformation, but also proliferation of alternative news sites that are really, really doing amazing work. And I just mentioned a couple of them, and individuals as well. So this is all, I would say, very positive. The issue that we always face is one of resources, right? One of the reasons the genocide is happening is simply because there's a massive asymmetry in political and financial power. And as activists, it does feel like we're pushing uphill. But we do have, I do think there are reasons to be optimistic. And I think there's a recent poll, for example, that shows in the US, for example, increasingly people are less sympathetic to Israel because of what they're doing by a substantial amount, and more sympathetic to Palestinians. So it is indicating that some, or actually maybe a lot of the news is getting through. And even though we have these big tech platforms that take money from, pro-genocide propaganda and try to censor algorithms, that despite that, there is a level of human activism and decency that's shining through, whether it's on social media, whether it's on other sort of blog type news outlets. So, I think we just have to kind of keep banding together and keep a level of solidarity. And I know it sounds cliche, but we have to remain hopeful. And as much as I'm pessimistic, we mustn't let pessimism win, because in order to actually move forward and keep doing what we're doing, we need to maintain a level of hope and solidarity in order to drive that. So, I think, you know, we just have to keep struggling and keep fighting. Um, and if we were resourced, we need money. So I don't know, give organization money who are going to sue the ass off, Facebook and X and whatever, because that would be a start.
Yeah, I actually really appreciate where you've left this, because it's not hopeful in a don't worry, everything will be fine way, but I think realistically it's important to recognize that in this post-truth era, truth is still out there and facts do still matter, not as much as probably all three of us wish they would, but you two are both heroic in trying to elevate facts and make facts matter. And I mean, it is, I think, quite extraordinary and shows a shift in the way the world works, that even with the massive disproportionate resources of the alt-truth side, that they're still not winning the public narrative. They're not. And that's probably why we're going to see even more of a crackdown on free speech going forward. But it's not a handful of people. It's huge numbers of people that are watching and listening and looking for information in a way they never have been able to before. So I think that's actually a little bit hopeful. So we are going to leave it there. So first, I want to thank you, Marc and Assal, so much for joining me today. I could talk to you guys for hours. I hope maybe we can come back and have another conversation. I want to thank our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts, and people watching on YouTube. Thank you. Check out our website, www.fmep.org, for the resources related to this podcast and lots of other neat stuff on Palestine and Israel. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast to stay up to date. We have lots of great content. It's on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Spotify. And of course, there are videos of them, and you can see one of Marc's cats on YouTube. So with that, I'm Lara Friedman, signing off now until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.